Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, which I entitled Death and Transfiguration, because I always thought that was a fascinating title. It's a tone poem by Richard Wagner, which is actually a very beautiful piece. But its fundamental theme, I found after I wrote the description of the webinar, was actually kind of restrictive, because what I really want to focus on tonight is getting prepared for death, our own or that of a loved one or someone we're close to, in not just the material ways, of course, but in terms of settling any debts or any issues that need to be resolved, and of understanding what the process of the transformation or transfiguration, if you will, actually is, and being comfortable with that. And then actually getting a really good send-off. And so I will describe such experiences that I've had in my practice, and the things that that showed me what I thought was a good approach, a very effective approach towards preparing for death and actually going through the process. First topic, the matter of debt. I'm going to tell stories to illustrate all my points tonight. The first topic, I was reminded long ago that it's important to settle whatever debts and whatever difficulties you've had, whatever conflicts may still remain in your life, to settle those before you pass on, so that you don't carry that karma forward and don't leave that karma also for those who are left behind. And so the story was that a man was telling me that as his father was about to pass away from cancer, that the father asked him to go to the bank and withdraw a certain amount of money, and it was a few $100s, as I recall, and take it to a shopkeeper in town and to give him the money to settle a debt that was outstanding for something like 15 or 20 years. They had had some dispute over something, that whatever their transaction was, and this man's father had never paid the shopkeeper for whatever it was he had supplied. And so the man went into the store and found the shopkeeper and said, "My father's dying of cancer, and he wanted to settle his debt with you. So here's the money." And he handed it to him. And the shopkeeper opened his cash register. And this is why this story is so important. The shopkeeper opened his cash register, pulled out the 15 or 20-year-old bill, wrote "paid in full" on it, and handed it to this man and said to him, "Please, tell your father that I appreciate his paying off the debt, and my, condolences to you and your whole family on his passing." And that was the end of that transaction. And of course, it illustrates something that was always very much a part of our culture, but which I sense has faded away, because I haven't heard anyone talk about it in quite a long time. And that was the idea of clearing whatever debts that you might have. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a financial debt. It could be anything that you feel that you owe to anyone else, so that you don't carry that karma forward, but also so they don't carry that karma forward, so they don't hold the burden of whatever negative feeling they have about you, which might be passed on to you for a future incarnation, or passed on to your family, or even both. So clearing up of debts is a very important thing. The next area is in the area of relationships. And the following story that I'll tell describes not only a matter of healing relationships, but also describes how I learned very much about the process of the transfiguration, the passage from one's life on Earth to an afterlife. And I had already heard about, the cycle of birth and death and rebirth, and was familiar with it, but had never had a direct experience to confirm that the stories that I had heard were actually true. So this particular story is actually about myself and my mother. And my mother faded away extremely slowly. And there were some unresolved issues, shall we say, between her and myself. And one of the foremost of those was that where she had envisioned me as a pediatrician in either a substantial practice or a large medical center where I might have been teaching and doing research and practicing pediatrics, I had chosen a much different path and was also spending a great deal of time meditating. And my mother, although she had learned transcendental meditation, had never really practiced it regularly. And I did do a little bit of meditation with her in her final years, which she actually seemed to enjoy. And that was a good thing. But she hadn't really come around to, gee, this was really a wise decision that you made to learn meditation and to continue that practice and to come to Fairfield instead of being off in some wonderful big city somewhere and being prestigious, which would have suited her just fine. And so as she was actually going through the transition, I was meditating with her. It was very early in the morning. My sister was there too, and at that time she was asleep, but then she woke up and meditated with me. But my mother's breathing began to change, and I realized that she was preparing to leave the body. And so I had suddenly a sense of fear, and I checked in and realized it wasn't my fear, it was her fear. And so I started just on the subtle level communicating with her soul about, it was okay what was happening and not to be afraid. Everything was fine. And it was going very smoothly. And she actually was perfectly comfortable and there was no reason to be upset. And she settled down, and I kept reassuring her, and gradually over a period of about 15 minutes, her soul actually exited from the body. And when it did, and this was the part that really convinced me that the transfiguration was absolutely an incredible thing. It was as though she had come like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon. Or a chrysalis, she like expanded her body, which had been all contracted by her disease, and felt herself light and free, and she could move around. And I actually saw her spirit sort of stretching and moving about, and enjoying the new freedom. And then I proceeded to do the Transcendental Meditation Cities program, and she was able to observe that from her state and see the effects of the cities, actually see them manifest. And she thought that was extremely fascinating. And she then concluded that what I had been doing for decades was actually a marvelous thing. And she was ready for a new adventure where she would be able to, do some of these things and have a great deal of fun. So she really, in that time, and it was some extended period of time, it was a couple of hours, and then over the next couple of days, we had some conversations, and she appreciated what I had been doing, and there was a whole reconciliation and just a pure exchange of good feeling between us. And so what did not get accomplished while still in this earthly form did get accomplished after she had passed. And that was a really wonderful thing. And so there's several points, obviously, to take away from this story. One is that the process of transformation is really a magnificent thing, and not something to be feared, something to be understood. And of course, for those who are used to experiencing transcendental consciousness, it's a lot easier to accept that because it takes place on that very subtle level, that subtlest level of being. And it allows, being familiar with that allows one to just basically experience the transition in all of its glory and to really, really appreciate it. So that story, I think, illustrates several of those points so very nicely. The next point I wanted to cover is doing the send off. And I like to think of it that way. It's sending one off to a new adventure. And usually, when people are dying, we who are living tend to feel very sad and quite taken with grief. We may also have some feelings of relief, particularly if a person's been sick for quite some time or has been senile, had Alzheimer's disease or such. And it's like almost merciful that they finally exit the body. So there can be those kind of feelings too. But usually we tend to feel rather sad about the event, even if we feel like, well, it was their time and it was a good thing. Now, when someone dies, as we say, before their time, meaning when they're young, it's much harder to feel like, yes, they've lived their life and that was a good thing. It is still possible, however, and it is one of the things that grief counselors often like to point out to people, that they did live. And they lived their life, and they lived what life they had, whether that be a few days or weeks or years or a couple of decades or whatever it is. But still, the culture tends to teach us that we should feel very sad. And that's a very real phenomenon, that as much of our grieving is related to what the culture has taught us and presented to us as what the normal experience of dying is supposed to be. And so it's kind of hard to conceive of celebrating a passage like that. Now, my first experience of that was actually as I was already a physician, and a very prominent member of the community that I was practicing in Pennsylvania passed away, and I went to the service. And it was a very large church, and I think it was essentially full. Because the person was very well known, and all kinds of people from the city, as well as members of the congregation, came to the church for the service. And the young minister, whom I knew, got up, and his first words were, "We have gathered today to celebrate the life of," and then he started talking about the person, and I couldn't even hear him after that, and I was going, "Celebrate. We're here to celebrate, not to mourn, not to grieve, not to be upset, not to be wringing hands and wearing black clothing and painting ourselves with ashes, but to actually celebrate the life that this person had." And they had lived a good life. I think they were in their 50s or maybe had just turned 60. They weren't that old. And they died a bit premature, you might say. But it was the sense of celebration. And I carried that with me ever since, just that idea that when one concludes a life, in our hearts, we should be celebrating that life and what they did, what they accomplished, who they were, what children they may have produced, and things, like that. So that experience really brought into my awareness that notion of celebration. So I had the pleasure of attending a passing of a member of our community a few years ago, and I had just learned some healing at that point. I was doing an energy technique that I had learned, read quite a bit about, and I really enjoyed doing it. And I had worked on this person some. They had a surgery, and it was not healing very well. And I said, "Can I do something to help?" And they said, "Well, if you could make this surgery heal up, I'd be a lot more comfortable." So I worked on them, and very quickly, I think it was just a couple of sessions, and the bleeding that was going on stopped, and they were much more comfortable. And so a few days later, they announced to me that they were going to die, and they wanted my help. And I had no idea what I was supposed to do. And so I asked the fellow, "What is it you want?" And he said, "I want you to help me have a smooth transition and to be, without stress about it." And I said, "Well, my job as a physician, I was retired even, but I still thought like a physician. I said, my job is to help people live, not to help them die. I have to give this some thought. So I thought about it just overnight, actually, and I realized that if that's what they wanted, then that's what I would do. Honestly, I had no idea how to do that, but I figured I would just do it. And so I started working on them, and I realized that that had a lot to do with transferring the energy from the bodily chakra, which are the first, second, and third chakra, up into the upper chakra, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh. And I went to work on that and actually learned how to do it with this fellow. So I was very grateful that he gave me the opportunity. Um, and then as he was fading away, his care became kind of difficult, and he wound up in the hospital. And so, as he was at the end of his life, just a few days later, I was there in the hospital with him, with a family and members of the community. There was quite a number of us in the room, actually. The hospital was rather gracious about allowing so many people in the room. And it wasn't a question of trying to keep him, safe from germs or anything. It was all over at that point. And so we participated in that transition. And as he was passing, we were all thanking him for, being our friend and all the wonderful things he had done, and for his work that he had done, which was really wonderful stuff that we were all appreciating. And as he then completed his transition, we were all saying goodbye and what a great time we had had with him. And it was quite a celebration, actually. I think the staff of the hospital on the other side of the door, which was closed, was probably a little dumbfounded, because I can't imagine that anything quite like that actually happened very often. Because it was quite raucous, to be very honest about it. It was quite raucous. There were some other details which aren't really relevant to this presentation, but the idea was that we celebrated the actual event, the actual transition, and gave him encouragement to go on to higher levels of being. And I have every reason to believe that we were successful. He seemed, as I checked in after he passed, he seemed very happy with his send-off and very appreciative. And there was a wonderful memorial celebration. There was a cremation celebration, which was also a very interesting thing. I wasn't going to talk about this, but it was quite an interesting thing that we had a funeral celebration that was done in what we call here a Vedic style, with chanting and everyone puts flowers into the casket, and which is just a cardboard casket when one is going to be cremated, and you literally bury the person in flowers. It's a beautiful thing, and everybody gets to participate. It's a very big celebration of the send off, of the kind of final send off. We're now going to turn the body back into ashes and return it to the earth, and the person gets to be free to move on to higher levels. So that experience also with him was a very marvelous part of the celebration of the life and the transition itself. And so then we had a memorial service, and that was again one of those fantastic celebrations of life, and everybody talking about the impact that person had had on their lives and how he contributed to their happiness and well-being. And it was just absolutely beautiful, as most of the memorial services here in our community are. Really a wonderful, wonderful experience. So that whole transition of my friend gave me a great deal of sense of the importance of celebrating life. And of course, it also applies even before you die to living every life and celebrating every day as something very special, and honoring that for your own self. And of course, for those, around you, your family and friends. But to live every life as a treasure rather than as some kind of drudgery, even if you're not feeling well, but to still appreciate what it is you have, and to be grateful for the love and support that you get from other people. So celebration and appreciation of life is just another one of those components that's so very, very important. I wanted to spend a few minutes. I thought I would talk about this a lot. And the more I've thought about it, the more I realized that though I've had some experience and know something, I really don't know enough. And that's about suicide. Um, and I had to confront, excuse me, suicide in several different ways in my life. When I was even in medical school, one of the psychiatric residents was talking to the students, and I was one of the students in the group, um, about why people commit suicide. And he said, there are the usual things that, well, they feel really down. They don't feel life's worth living, that they can't find the energy to keep going, that they think they'd be better off dead than they are alive, and things like that, which I think we're all familiar with, and hopefully don't give too much thought to. But it does happen to people. And people who are depressed are often in that kind of state where the depression feels so heavy and so unrelenting that after, usually months and sometimes years, they just feel like it just isn't worth it anymore. I just can't do this any longer. I just can't bear this burden. Um, and so some people either attempt or actually succeed in killing themselves. So that's a very common reason. But the thing that startled me about his presentation was he said many times depressed, pardon me, many times people commit suicide as a way of expressing their anger at other people. And it's a way of saying, you're going to be sorry. I'm going to leave a note that says that I'm killing myself because of the way you treated me, and you're going to feel guilty the rest of your life, and I'm going to get my revenge. And that's, unfortunately, karmically, that's a very bad thing to do, obviously, uh, because it means that not only do you hurt someone else who then has to carry that karma, but you carry that karma, then that bitterness with you forward, so that you're going to have to work that out in another lifetime. So it's not a good thing to do, in case that comes up. But it really struck me. I would never forget that when he said that it's the ultimate inappropriate expression of anger, taking it out on yourself in order to punish somebody else. But actually, in minor ways, that goes on quite a bit with people. And I've learned in subsequent years to recognize that kind of behavior of hurting yourself as a way of, in your mind at least, hurting someone else. It doesn't always work, of course, that way, but it is a piece of behavior that bears looking at and straightening out, so that it's better. But suicide is not at all rare, and it's an unfortunate thing when it happens because of the pain that it causes those that are left behind. And one of the things I've discovered is that people who commit suicide seem to lack a sense, even though some people do it in order to hurt other people, but most people don't, and they don't realize how that's going to affect those that they leave behind, particularly their family and other people that have regarded them well. And it's part of that is that they're very much, I'm going to do it like this, inside themselves. They're very much locked in and are not really properly apprehending their worth in other people's awareness, how other people are evaluating them. So that is something that it drives people. Not drives them, that's not the right word. It's something that people who are contemplating suicide often actually don't grasp. So there's like two groups. There's one group that is doing it to hurt other people, and the other group that doesn't realize they're going to hurt other people. And then there's the thing about assisted suicide, or intentional, that's not the right word, a situation where a person is terminally ill and is ready to just give up and leave the body, but the body's not ready to die yet. And so there's a Hemlock Society, I know, is one of the groups that actually helps people to find ways that they can end their life in a dignified way, rather than having to go through a long, really protracted, miserable state of suffering before the body finally gives up. The body is very tenacious, and of course, the traditional teaching is that we have a instinct to live, an instinct to stay alive. Some people say we have a death instinct or a death wish. That may or may not be true. It may be one of those archetypal kinds of things that's very strong in some people and very, very weak in others. Probably most of us really don't have a very strong death wish. But we see people who engage, for instance, in extreme sports, that you kind of wonder, if there isn't a part of them that is trying to challenge death in some way, trying to challenge their own abilities to see if they can survive, extremely risky situations. So I wonder about those people sometimes. I don't understand them, I have to confess, and I haven't had the opportunity to work with anybody yet. But now that I've mentioned it, maybe someone will come along, and I'll have the chance to explore that with them. It is another potential thing. And then just to wrap up, part of the understanding that helps us overcome any kind of fear and resistance that I just have to keep going. I can't die. I'm afraid to die. I don't want to die, or whatever. Part of what helps us to overcome that when it's appropriate, that is to say, when the body is actually trying to die, is just to have the intellectual understanding that it isn't a painful process. It's not a terrible thing. The culture doesn't really support that understanding terribly well. We either have teachings that we don't understand it, or that we may have gotten a religious kind of heaven and hell teaching where we wonder whether we've been good enough to get to heaven, and maybe we're not really going to make it, and this is going to be a really bad thing that's coming. So there are those possibilities that we may face that could make us have a great deal of anxiety about the process. But fundamentally, the process is a very simple one. There's a sense of freedom afterwards, and then all kinds of possibilities. There's an amazing book called The Afterlife of Billy Fingers. Billy Fingers. Yeah, some people here are familiar with that work. And it's pretty amazing. It's sufficiently detailed that I have some reason to believe that it probably was told honestly and truthfully, but it is pretty incredible. And it's about somebody whom you would never expect by the usual standards where we measure a life by, accomplishment and good things that people do. Billy Fingers was actually kind of, he was a gambler, if I remember, and I can't remember all the details, and not a terribly nice person, and wasn't even very good to his family. And fell into a fairly bad crowd, if I remember, and then died. Quite drugs, yeah, a lot of drugs, and then died at a young age. And then his sister went to recover his body, and then he started visiting her for quite some time afterwards, and telling her about his experience. And it seemed that he may actually had achieved some enlightenment, and was not going to be coming back. He was going to move on to higher celestial realms. And your first thought always is, he didn't deserve it. I've lived a much better life than he did. I don't feel at all confident that I'm not going to have to come back. And here's Billy, who was really quite a jerk in this lifetime, but apparently worked off some karma that he needed to work off. That was his final burden, and then he was relieved of that. And so he came back and told his sister some wonderful stories. And so it's a great book if you care to read it. The Afterlife of Billy Fingers. I can't remember the author's name. Perhaps somebody remember? I don't remember it now. But it's quite a story.
It's circulating here in the libraries.
The question is being asked of me if it was circulating in our library. You can certainly check. It would only take a few seconds online to find out if it's in the library. Yeah, I don't know, but I know people do have it. Um, oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's available. You have to pay for it, but online. But you probably can check it out of the Fairfield Public Library because it has quite a collection of esoterica. And if that fails, try Revelations. They might have it in the bookstore. Very good. So, are there any questions about what I've been talking about this evening? Very good. Yeah.
What about thoughts of not getting done things you wanted to get done?
Oh, yes, I left that out. Thoughts about not having done things you wanted to do. Hmm?
Thoughts or anxieties about
Yeah, or anxieties about it. Yeah. Um, One of the concepts I was going to talk about, I skipped over it, was the bucket list. And that is as you and you don't have to be dying to write out a bucket list, which simply means things you think you'd like to accomplish yet in this lifetime. And the idea of writing it down is to make it more concrete. Say, here's what I want to do yet in my life. I want to go to Greece or some South America or wherever it might be, and I want to do this activity and see that show and whatever it might be. Um, so uh, the bucket list can be a very valuable thing as one gets a little bit older, or even at the very end of life. There's a wonderful movie called The Bucket List with Morgan Freeman and oh dear, I thought of it earlier. I'm sorry, I've forgotten, but you can look that one up. Yeah, The Bucket List. And so they develop a bucket list, and it really explores this whole concept that rather than die with frustrations of things you didn't accomplish, you don't have to do everything actually on the list to achieve the effect of making yourself feel that I lived my life. I did the things I wanted to do. Some of them I had to wait to the very end, but I got them in. And so it's a way of, again, not leaving with regret about life. Oh, I could have done more. I could have done this. I could have done that. And of course, anytime we die, that's then you come see me, and we'll work it out. If we don't get them done, you come. Well, that's a head trip, asking whether or not they needed to be done. It's a question of what do you need? It's all about need. What do you need to feel like you lived a full life? That's what the real question is. And if you feel like you lived a full life, then you're okay. You don't need to do more. But if you feel incomplete in that way, and you need some closure for your life, then making a bucket list and actually doing some of the things can be valuable. Yeah, you don't have to do them all. It's not necessary. Right? Usually it's that you get up off your chair, so to speak. If you're sitting in your chair, not literally, this is a metaphor. If you're sitting back and you're saying, it was a pretty good life, but there was a lot of things I wanted to do and I just didn't do them. And you're kind of blaming yourself maybe, or you're blaming circumstance or, lack of money or whatever it was, that you didn't get them done, then at least looking at them, what does it mean? Why did I want to do that? What did I need? And is there maybe even some other way I can fulfill the need if there's no way to climb to the top of Mount Everest? You just may not be up for a climb to the top of Mount Everest, but maybe you can climb some other mountain, or maybe you figure out why you needed to climb the mountain, and you make peace with that need, what it was that was driving you in that direction. Because it, excuse me, that may not have been something that your karma required. It may have just been something that your mind required. So this is why people come see me, because we work out those issues like that, so that one is free of regret, and able to move on and enjoy this life as for what it was, and feel good about this life, to value the life. Yes.
I kind of sometimes wonder that sometimes people that have been on a spiritual path and they're who die fairly young, that maybe there's a speculation that maybe they just needed to move beyond this body. There's something that they needed to get through that they couldn't finish in this body. They needed to move on to a new life in this sense.
Yeah, either that, or one of the things I've heard, in no position to assess the validity of it, but one of the things I've heard is they feel that I'm in this body, but I don't need to be here anymore. I've already done what I came to do in this life. So whether it's, I'm sorry, say it again.
Say somebody, maybe there's some blockage, some way they're blocked. They can't, or resisting or something, what they need to do next for their ascension or their enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they just need to die and move on to another body, and then they can really get beyond that.
Yeah,
That's a speculation.
That's a speculation about whether or not they need to drop this body in order to move on evolutionally. I honestly don't think that that's something one can know while you're in a body, but there are others people who do believe that that's possible, and that you can feel like, again, it's kind of like I've done what I came to do, and I don't need this body anymore. I maybe need a different body, or I don't need any body. I can't take an opinion on that. It's something I haven't had the opportunity to work with somebody who was feeling that way. I have heard of it in this community, people who were spiritual seekers, if you will, or on a spiritual path, who felt like either they felt like they finished, or that this body wasn't the one that they needed. So I can't pass any judgment on that, and I don't have the experience yet, but maybe I will someday get a chance to explore that. It would not be the usual thing. I have some doubts about whether one in a body can really know that, because even people who gain enlightenment, they don't say, well, okay, I'm done, and go jump off a cliff. They usually feel that, okay, I've achieved this level of awareness, and now I can spread that light to other people, even just by my life, the way I live my life, or they go off to some mountaintop and meditate. So yes.
What about homicides? Yeah, murder.
Yeah, go ahead. What about them? What about homicide? He's asking.
It's opposite of suicide, dying of disease.
Right.
In the death relation.
Right.
Like the mass murder last week.
Right, or even just one murder, or if it's a mass murder. Traditional teaching is that it is extremely bad karma.
To be the guy committing the homicide.
Right, to commit the homicide. For the victims, there's usually an element of either surprise, or severe. I can't think of the word. Resentment. That their life was cut short in that way. It's different from dying in an honorable battle, which does not bring that karma, but to just be murdered,
like the guys in Las Vegas.
Like the people in Las Vegas, yeah. And there's a shared karma there, their families and everybody who's in shock. I heard some of the stories that people told that were just horrific, because, there were couples together, and then all of a sudden one of them was dead. And it was terribly shocking. So there's a mutual resistance. The person who dies, is obviously likely to feel if to whatever degree they're able to assess the situation, that it was, you know, that they'd have a lot of resentment of at having their life cut short like that. And of course, the people who their loved ones would feel the same resentment. So it's a terrible, terrible karma that way.
Not to mention that kill come for the guy that did it.
The karma of the guy that did it, particularly the guy in Las Vegas, unfathomable. Unfathomable. It doesn't look good from here.
And he committed suicide.
And he also killed himself. Yes, it was bizarre beyond all belief.
And about ISIS and those suicide bombers.
Yeah, suicide bombers. That's another category. That's an interesting one, because they do that out of an intense belief that they must lash out to express their anguish over what's been done to them in their culture, their society.
Wants to do that,
Well, they bring in ideas about God and such, and justifying it. So there's often a lot of rationalization behind it. But those people are generally motivated by extreme anguish and resentment at what's been done to them and their people. And they feel that they're very much wronged. Now, sometimes when we look at that from the outside, like two tribes that war at each other kind of perpetually, we say, well, that's pretty silly. You know, it's just there's no real reason to do that. One side kills somebody, and then the other side gets mad and they kill somebody on the other side, and back and forth like that. It's the Hatfield and McCoy thing, which has been played out in many cultures, actually. And I have some familiarity with that. And part of the reason for that is that it's always been that way. I mean, they have that sense. It's always been that way. That's what we do. And so it's very hard to change that, and, you know, to find peace. I'm sure that there are members of both tribes or both communities, clans, that would feel that it would be desirable for that to end, but they kind of know that it can't because it's always been that way. So that's a very, very unfortunate thing. Those are very good questions, George. Thank you. Very, very nice.
and also about killing things like bugs, flies, cockroaches.
He's talking about the bugs now. I'm not going to go to the bugs. Let's move on. Actually, it's time we get down to our group clearing session. And so what I thought we'd do tonight, I'll let everybody sit comfortably. I'm going to move, as I always do, off camera, but you'll still be able to hear me just fine. But just give me a moment to move.